Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Housing Works Bookstore Cafe. I have the great pleasure of introducing this event this evening. My name is Molly Michael. I am the Director of Marketing here, and I'm happy to welcome C-SPAN and Book TV back to the space to cover this really fabulous event. Before I tell you about our participants this evening, I just want to give you a very brief overview about Housing Works and the bookstore for those of you who don't know much about the space or about Housing Works. We are a nonprofit bookstore. All of our stock is donated. We're run almost entirely by volunteers, and all of our proceeds go toward Housing Works, Inc., which is the largest minority-controlled AIDS service organization in the entire country. And we serve tens of thousands of clients annually. We provide housing and advocacy at the state and city and federal levels. And it's even more important to provide these kinds of services in New York City in particular in this country, because while in New York City we make up 3% of the United States population, we are home to 16% of this country's AIDS cases. So here in New York, we really are ground zero for the epidemic nationwide. So thank you so much for coming out this evening and supporting such a great cause. And also, if you are ever interested in visiting our website, all of our events are posted. You can make a donation to Housing Works, Inc. It's housingworks.org, and I encourage you all to go there. And now I have the great pleasure of kicking off this author-to-author event with Dr. P.W. Singer, Roger Rosenblatt, and moderated by Chris Hedges. And so forgive me for this canned introduction, but I want to make sure that I introduce these guys properly and give them the credit that they deserve. Dr. Singer is the National Security Fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies Program at the Brookings Institution and Director of the Brookings Project on U.S. Policy Toward the Islamic World. He's written for the Boston Globe, the L.A. Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Current History, Survival, International Security, and World Policy Journal. He's provided commentary on military affairs for media outlets including ABC, Al Jazeera, BBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, and NBC. And this event this evening is to discuss his new book published by Pantheon this month, Children at War. And also participating this evening is Roger Rosenblatt. He's a journalist, an author, playwright, and teacher. His essays for the NewsHour have won a Peabody and an Emmy Award. His essays for Time magazine have won 2 George Polk Awards. His journalism career began in 1975 as a literary editor of The New Republic. He's been a columnist and an editor-at-large for Life magazine, editor of U.S. News and World Report, a columnist and editorial board member of The Washington Post, and editor-at-large of Time, Inc. His work has appeared in The New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, The New Republic, Esquire, and I'm sure many, many, many more places. His book, Children of War, an account of young people growing up on modern battlegrounds from Northern Ireland to the Middle East and Cambodia, won the 1983 Robert F. Kennedy Book Prize and was a National Book Critics Circle finalist. And finally, our moderator this evening, Christopher Hedges, is a reporter for the New York Times, was a war correspondent for nearly 2 decades in Central America, Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. He is the author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which was a National Book Critics Circle Awards finalist. And his new book, Losing Moses on the Freeway, America's Broken Covenant with the Ten Commandments, will be published in June, so please check that out when it comes out. And now I have the great pleasure again of welcoming these 3 to the table. Thank you.
Why don't you start?
Well, I wanted to begin by thanking all of you for coming out this evening, and I thought it best to start off what's a chilly evening outside with a chilling quote. This is from a young boy in West Africa. I was attending primary school. The rebels came and attacked us. They killed my mother and father in front of my eyes. They took me with them. They trained us to fight. The first time I killed someone, I got so sick I thought I was going to die. But I got better. My fighting name was Blood Never Dry. As our moderator mentioned, my research is on changes in warfare, in particular the rise of new forces in warfare and how it affects national security. And Children at War looks at one of the darker sides of this, the rise of child soldier groups. As Nobel Peace Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, quote, "It is immoral that adults should want children to fight their wars for them. There is simply no excuse, no acceptable argument for arming children. The problem is, while there's no moral excuse, this practice is out there and it's growing every single day." And so what the book seeks to do is take the first comprehensive look at it. Why is it happening? How is it happening? What are the implications of it? And with that, what can we do about it? And in the book, I tried to tap into expertise, everything from military history to neuropsychology. The interviews I did for it ranged from child soldiers to mercenaries who'd been hired to fight them. And my hope in writing it was really three things. The first is, once you learn of this issue and the fact that it's out there but so few people are aware of it, you feel compelled to tell these stories and get the message out that these children are not only victims, they're also heroes at the same time. The second thing is that I wanted to tell it in a way that was not only interesting and brought the tragedy to the front, but also added to understanding, with the idea that our responses so far have not been effective, and part of that's because we haven't dealt with the real underlying causes of what's going on. And hopefully this will help answer that. And then finally, I wanted to offer a new lens to look at this issue, not just the pure moral tragedy of it, but point out that there are some real-world implications for it, and real-world implications even for us in the West who don't know about this. For example, the fact that our soldiers are out there dealing with it every single day. And with that, we see that there's not just a moral obligation to act, but a strategic mandate to act as well. And today, security is the new coin of the realm, and hopefully that'll force our hands a little bit. So what I'd like to do in sort of the brief remarks today is talk about where this has come from, what's happening out there, what are the causes of it, and then later on we can talk about what can we do. But I think it's important first to start off with the history of this. The rule once held in warfare that children had no place in it, neither as victims nor as participants. Now the rule is that war is not complete without them. To put it another way, when you look at the last 4,000 years of warfare, when children appear in it, it's mainly as footnotes in small isolated instances. For example, in the Navy ships of Admiral Nelson, you had the powder monkeys, which were young boys who ran ammunition back and forth. In our Civil War, there was one battle, the Battle of Newmarket in 1864, where the Confederacy used a unit of 247 VMI cadets. But these were exceptions to what the rule used to be. And we typically didn't see children present at all. We didn't see them as targets. We didn't see them serving in combatant roles. And no one rushed out to copy the examples. Today, it's a far different thing. On the victim side, in the last decade, more than 2 million children have been killed in warfare. On the participant side, there's more than 300,000 child soldiers out there. There's another 500,000 children who are serving in armed forces that are not at war right now. Another way to look at these numbers is if you take the entire collection of the world's armed forces, everything from militaries to insurgent groups to terrorist groups, 40% of them use children. 20% of them use children under the age of 12. Another way to look at the numbers is that children fight in almost 75% of the world's wars. They fought on every single continent but Antarctica. So they're out there and they're present. And it's important to note that sometimes people try and quibble with the age point of 18 as being the childhood point. And there's a couple things to say about that. The first is 18 is not just some Western construct. It's actually international law, the most widely signed international law. 190 countries have signed that law. But it's also the age point at which countries all around the world award different rights and privileges, everything from health care to education to voting. But even when you look at history, when you look at military history, this age point was something different. For example, of when someone joined warfare. The Zulu tribe in Africa, it wasn't until you were between the ages of 18 to 20 that you were allowed to serve as a warrior. In the ancient Greek armies, in the Spartan army, there were young boys between the ages of 14 and up, but they only served as herders of the cattle that followed them. They didn't serve as combatants. In northern Uganda, where there's a particular child soldier problem right now, during the tribal period, you weren't allowed to become a warrior until you were married because it was such an honor and a privilege. Today, that's been flipped on its head. And this is the final thing to note, is that we're not talking about 17-and-a-half-year-olds. We're talking about those at the age of childhood that any sane person would describe it. The average age is 12 and a half. That's from 2 separate surveys. The youngest ever child soldier was a 5-year-old in Uganda. The youngest ever child terrorist was a 9-year-old in Colombia. And so what this means is that now, as a consequence of our military deployment after 9/11, our forces have come into contact with child soldiers everywhere they've deployed. And while it's not been discussed in the media that much, we've also fought child soldiers every single place that we've deployed. The very first U.S. combat casualty in the war on terrorism was the Green Beret sergeant who was killed by a 14-year-old sniper. Just a couple months ago, our forces in Afghanistan picked up a 12-year-old who'd taken part of an ambush of U.S. forces there. In Iraq, the practice has grown. Before the war, Saddam Hussein set up this force called the Ashbal Saddam. It was a paramilitary unit of boys between the ages of 10 to 15, and it served as a feeder organization into the Saddam Fedayeen, which was this paramilitary unit that was run by his son Uday. And a lot of people remember the Fedayeen because these were the guys that actually fought back during the invasion as opposed to the Iraqi army that mostly ran. Child soldiers fought U.S. forces in at least 3 different cities during the invasion, but it's after the invasion, during the insurgency, that it's taken off. A good indicator of this, a dark indicator of this, was the fact that the very same week that President Bush made his mission accomplished speech on the aircraft carrier, an Iraqi 12-year-old in the city of Mosul fired on U.S. forces with an AK-47. And since then, it's taken off. All 3 broad insurgent groups use child soldiers. The post-Saddam Baathists, the radical Shia groups, and some of the pictures that we're seeing here are from Muqtada Sadr's Mahdi army that fought in a pitched battle in Najaf. And actually the spokesperson of that army didn't deny they had child soldiers, and they were as young as 12, actually extolled it and said this was an evidence of the fact that we are a popular army, that both the old men and the young boys are coming out to fight for us. And then finally, the Sunni Triangle and the fighting there, we've seen it. In November, the U.S. Marines went back into Fallujah, and they talked about the challenges of having to fight, quote, children armed with assault rifles. So this is an issue that's very real, and it's one that we're having to deal with. And where I'll end in the discussion is, why has this come about? Why has this happened right now? And really, there's 3 things that have come together here. There's 3 causal factors. The first is we're living through the most prosperous period in human history, but we're also leaving people behind. And in particular, we're leaving a cohort of children behind. And you could put this in terms of there's now a lost generation. And so all the ills of the world are falling hardest on children. There's more than 250 million children who are homeless out there. There's another 25 million children who are refugees or internally displaced. A special at-risk group that these warlord groups target are orphans. And that cohort is larger, both because of warfare, but also because of disease. By the year 2010, 43 million children will have lost either both or one of their parents to AIDS. So what that means is it's a larger pool of potential combatants, but it's the second force that what has activated this. This wouldn't have mattered a couple of generations ago, but there's been changes in warfare, in particular changes in the technology of warfare. The military looks at what are described as light weapons, the assault rifles, the RPGs. They describe them as man-portable weapons. And these are the main things that are really used in warfare today, not the big ticket budget items that we talk about in Congress, but actually these are the ones that most people use and cause over 90% of the casualties. What's happened now is that they're not just man-portable, they're child-portable. They're lighter because of the incorporation of plastics. They're simpler and easier to learn how to use. The AK-47 has 9 moving parts, and 10-year-olds will tell you how they learned how to use it in under 30 minutes. They're proliferating. There's more than 550 million small arms out there in the globe, enough for one for every 12 persons, which means that they're cheap. You can buy an AK-47 for the price of a goat in Kenya. And then finally, they're far more lethal. That 10-year-old has the same firepower as a Civil War regiment. And so that means that children can be effective combatants. They may not be as good as professional soldiers at the start, but they certainly can be enough to cause disruption in civil society, particularly when targeting unarmed civilians. And over time, they can become quite good. One of the interviews I did was with a former U.S. Green Beret who was now working in Africa in a private capacity. And he had been training a unit of child soldiers. And he described the child soldiers he was working with as the best soldiers he'd worked with in his 18 years of experience in Africa. Not the best child soldiers, but the best overall. And then finally, it's the context of war that matters. Warfare itself is changing. We have this image of war as men in uniform fighting for the political cause of their nation state, and it's not like that. It's men, it's women, and it's children. The groups that they fight in are everything from state armies, and that's increasingly rare, to warlord groups, to insurgent groups, to terrorist groups. And the causes are rarely political now. They're religious, socioeconomic, personal profit. Sometimes the reasons don't even make sense, and children in these groups are even beaten if they ask what is the cause. You saw that, for example, among kids in Sri Lanka. And it's this context of failed states and conflict entrepreneurs who profit from the existence of warfare that's driving this, and the postmodern morphing of warrior and civilian. And the best case example of this is the story of Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor was an escaped convict from Plymouth Prison in Massachusetts. He escaped from that jail, went back home to Liberia where he was from, and on Christmas Eve he invaded the country. But he only had about 150 adult followers. People in the capital didn't even know they'd been invaded. But over the next couple years, he builds out his force through child soldiers, both through abduction raids, targeting orphanages, and through convincing children to join. Some of the kids talked about how they were promised they would get a Mercedes-Benz when Charles Taylor won the war. Other kids talked about how they were told they would get a home computer. Obviously, this is not a reason why you join a war, and Taylor didn't deliver on it when he won the war. Within a couple years, Taylor is running what's called Taylorland, this enclave in the jungle where they're illegally selling timber to Western corporations, and he's pulling in $300 million a year. A couple years later, Taylor wins the Civil War, and he becomes president of Liberia. So through child soldiers, this petty criminal became a king. And then other people looked at that model, and it spread like a virus. And we saw child soldier groups then go from Liberia to Sierra Leone to Guinea to Cote d'Ivoire to you could find former child soldiers from Liberia fighting as far away as Congo. It's more than 1,000 miles away. And hopefully we can talk about what can we do about this and what are some of the implications on this, but where I like to end on it is this is obviously a dark issue, but we have to face up to it. This is war as it is, not how we wish it would be. But there is a takeaway. When we look back at history, there's all sorts of practices that have fallen by the wayside that we now can't even believe happened. Just a few centuries ago, it was considered completely proper to take your POWs, the prisoners that you captured, they were your personal property, and to use them as slaves. A little more than a century ago, it was your obligation. It was the white man's burden to go out and invade countries to lift them up into civilization. Hopefully, we'll look back at this period when the rules of warfare broke down as another one of these anomalies. But it's only going to happen if we match the will of those who've chosen to do evil to children with our own will to do good. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a couple issues that hopefully Roger and Peter can address. For those of us that have covered conflicts where you have militias in places like the Congo, child warriors, armed children, are perhaps some of the most frightening elements. And I think, as I remember you addressed this in your book, Peter, and perhaps you can speak to it too as well, they oftentimes are, especially when they're as young as 12 or 13, they don't have, I think, a concept of what it is they're doing in terms of the actual killing that they're carrying out. And when you're stopped at a roadblock and you run into child warriors, you sense that there is no line of demarcation. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, for those of us that have covered these conflicts, running into a roadblock filled with child warriors is far more frightening than running into a roadblock of adults.
One of the things that I was surprised by during the course of this was actually the younger the child is, often the more frightening they are to their fellow child soldiers. And you would talk to kids in the range of 14 to 15 in Liberia and Sierra Leone who were scared of the younger boy units, and they called them SBUs, small boy units. And those were kids in the ranges of 8 to 12. And they were frightened of them because they didn't know what they would do. And one of the young boys in that younger unit talked about if they got mad at the older kids, they'd just start shooting at them. And there's two things that I think are important here. The first is we have to remember that these are not just little adults. There's actually physical and psychological differences between an adult and a child. And when this 18-year point is really important, one of the things is the part of your brain that controls both your death concept but also your vision of risk is the prefrontal part of your brain. And it doesn't reach its full development until somewhere between the age of 18 to 20. And that's why, for example, little kids will climb a tree that we would not even look at, or when you go to a ski slope, it's, you know, you'll see them going down ski slopes that we would be scared to do. That's how this plays out in warfare. And these kids don't have a death concept, and they don't see the consequences, not only to them of the gunfire, but also what it means when they've killed. And then there's an added thing that these groups often do. They hop the kids up on drugs. And for example, in West Africa, it was a mix of heroin and gunpowder, which they thought would make it stronger. And these groups don't just do it because they're evil. I mean, they are evil, but they do it, they have a thought out process here. And it's two things. The first is it's a further disconnection. And the kids will say, you know, it was someone else. It was like I was on a different plane. When the bullets weren't coming at me and what I was doing, that was someone else. And then the second thing is it's meant as a way to bind them into that organization, to make them dependent on it. And that's another thing that we have to be able to figure out how to fight.
You want to talk about that, Robbie?
Well, my experience, Chris, with children in warfare was limited because my inquiry in Children of War was to look at the effects of warfare on civilian children populations. However, and in most cases there, in contrast, and maybe as a kind of a different layer of thought, but one that cooperates with what Peter was saying, I was mostly aware of the rational child, the sweet child, the child who had to become the adult in a situation where adults were very dangerous and were knocking one another off. There were, however, even when I was pursuing the story of Children of War, which was a story before it became a book, two situations. One in Lebanon where the Palestinian children were being trained as soldiers. And I'd also be interested to ask Peter when this sort of began more recently, because I was in situations that may have changed over these last 20 years or so. But even then, the Palestinian leaders, the PLO leaders, there was an admixture of both pride and secrecy about that. It was not something that they were going to boast about. And then the other context, which was the most horrific that I encountered, was the consequences, rather than the thing itself, of Pol Pot's work camps in Cambodia. And these were situations where children were, in effect, I suppose, soldiers in the maddened idea of war that came out of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. But what they did to one another, to be sure, at the behest of the adults, was the kind of torment that you could not possibly, nor ought you to imagine, that people could come up with of ways of inflicting pain, both psychological and physical. One of the things in Peter's fine book is, what do you do afterwards, and how are these effects, what effects do they have? However, I do remember, and also I found that same sweetness in Sudan, where I went for Vanity Fair, because I came across we came across a group of 400 or so lost boys, and they were setting up camp. And I must tell you, instead of finding anything bellicose or even approaching it, I found what one could honestly say would be the height of civilization. The first thing these boys, I went with Sebastian Salgado, the great photographer of human suffering, and the first thing they were interested in with Salgado and me was, did we have beds? Were we comfortable? Did we have food? This from kids who had been gone on a biblical trek all the way through from the north to the south of Sudan, barely surviving animals, disease, famine, and so forth. But I did also go for the New York Times Magazine with Salgado again to Rwanda. And there we did come across young, certainly in their early teens, young soldiers who I have no doubt would have knocked us off in a second. And I don't know quite how to convey it, because it's the first time I've thought about it as a result of your question, but it was an interesting experience. If you can think of the normal predisposition of adults towards children is kindness and welcome. And you want to take advantage of the situation where they're to be embraced. And then you see that same child, and you can remember those tendencies in oneself, how it can easily flop when you're a child, to the coldest look, as if I were not a person but a target and somebody to take out of the way. And it is on that capacity, that ruinous capacity of children, that the adults in these situations, in the military situations, play. They make them feel that that's a good way of life, that a war is a reasonable pursuit.
There's an emotional numbing that comes with killing, whether you're an adult or a child. But sort of having watched it from the outside, it seems that sort of numbing effect is more pronounced in children. One also gets a sense, and perhaps this is something you can address, that in war zones, these child soldiers do not have a high survival rate over the long term. I remember in the Iran-Iraq war, for instance, the Iranians would not only use young Iranian children, but they would recruit Yemeni children and send them running into the minefields. But they were not only expendable in the eyes of the commanders, but I think because of their emotional and physical frailty, it seemed that there was a very high attrition rate among child soldiers, and I don't know whether that's something you run into.
It's definitely something. It actually connects back to what you were talking about. In the Iranian-Iraqi war, they told these young boys they would wear keys around their necks because the key would unlock your way into heaven when you died. And during the Lebanese Civil War, it wasn't until the Iranians started sending in Revolutionary Guards to train that then you saw the rise of children there. And what this leads to and why it spread is actually teaching pathways where groups learn from each other, and they've seen the advantages of this. Another example is Lal Sena is a rebel group in Nepal that didn't start using child soldiers till it started jointly training with groups from Latin America and South Asia. And it's a particular group that uses girl child soldiers, and it claims that it does it to aid women's liberation. Again, these groups are taking advantage of kids. And this goes to what you were talking about, of the indoctrination techniques. When you talk to the kids, there's often very brutal techniques that are used to turn them into soldiers. Some groups have ones that are modeled after armies. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka have a 4-month training program where the kids get up at 5 a.m. and they train until 10 at night. And at the end of it, they're quite indoctrinated and trained. Other groups, particularly those that abduct, force the child to kill someone in their home village. It's a kill or be killed situation. And when you talk to them, they say, that's the breaking point. That's when I became someone else. That's when my old life ended, is some ways they put it. And they develop coping mechanisms. They call themselves by different names. Their jungle names is what they sometimes call it. And the names range from sort of laughable ones, Lieutenant Dirty Water, which was a kid who everyone joked he didn't bathe ever and he kind of smelled, to Blood Never Dry, which that first quote was from, which is meant he was always out there fighting. And it's another way of coping. It's a disconnection. It was this other person that was doing the killing. It wasn't me. It wasn't this my old identity. And this goes to what can we do if these children get the support they need. They can be turned back into children. And we have to realize that they're not just child soldiers, they're victims of the most political form of child abuse. But just like any other victim of abuse, it's going to shape their identity for the future. It might scar them, but it doesn't mean that they're lost goods forever. And some of the child soldiers I met were, one was a student at a very prestigious university in New England. Another was a major in the U.S. Marines who'd actually fought in the Lebanese Civil War as a child soldier. But they were, they're exceptions to the rule. Most of these kids don't get the support they need, and it's a question of resourcing.
I think that one of the issues that has to be looked at as well is the breakdown of nation states in continents like Africa. And I think that, especially with the end of the Cold War, I, who had been covering insurgencies in Central America that were disciplined, both militarily, I'm thinking of the Sandinistas of the FMLN, but also ideologically, all of that evaporated. And I'm wondering whether we can really address the issue of child soldiers when essentially we have dysfunctional states with no central authority, with competing warlords who essentially mount military operations for personal profit and personal gain. I mean, certainly covering the war in Yugoslavia, one very quickly realizes that ethnic warfare is a business. And all the Mercedes in Belgrade pointed to that. So I think that if we don't have centralized authority, if nation states are dysfunctional, I'm wondering how we can address that issue of child warfare. Do you want to?
Well, I don't know that this will be helpful, but I'd like to use you, in fact, to broaden it even beyond the nation states, to remind us of the context in which we're dealing. The whole idea of warfare, of war, throws you into a mad set of other consequences, other forms of reasoning, so that the kind of torment or suasion that is used for children becomes quite reasonable, and various minor tactics or great strategies all seem within a scheme of the intelligent and useful person. But in fact, this isn't so. And let me just read you a paragraph from War as a Force that gives us meaning, Chris Hedges' book, which gets to this in a different way, but does remind us of the context. Many of those who defy the collective psychosis of the nation are solitary figures once the wars end. Yet these acts of compassion were usually the best antidotes to the myths peddled by the nationalists, going to your nation-state question. Those who reached across lines to assist the enemy, in quotes, freed themselves from nationalist abstractions that dehumanized others. They were vaccinated against the cult of death that dominates societies in wartime. They reduced their moral universe to caring for another human being, and in this they were able to reject the messianic pretensions that come with a nationalist agenda. By accepting that they could only affect a few lives, they also accepted their small place in the universe. This daily lesson in humility protected them. They were saved not by what they could accomplish, but by faith. Such people are, however, very rare. And once you've established, as this elegant paragraph gives us, a context in which nothing makes sense but the death of another, then anything goes. Children, women, anything you can use for victory, because victory is the only thing that is of interest.
I think there's two really important things here. The first is that the model of warfare has changed, and that when you look at insurgencies, it used to be the Maoist model, that you were a fish in the sea, that you would build up your local support, and that was the way to success. Now it's the predatory model. It's seize what you can, and the local populace is just assets to target. It's about seizing diamond mines, controlling the drug trade, you name it. And we see this repeated all over. And so that alters warfare, and it makes it harder to end because you can't negotiate with groups like this. You also, because of child soldiers, see groups that have no viable ideology. The Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda is a group that's led by a fellow who thinks he's the Christian Holy Spirit. And under his interpretation of the Ten Commandments, owning sex slaves is allowed and riding bicycles is a sin. This guy is a nut job. And he has about 200 adult followers, but over the last decade, he's abducted and built out a force of 14,000 child soldiers, and he's fought a civil war. So what this is a David Koresh-like figure who's now operating in warfare. And how do you negotiate with a David Koresh-like figure? You can't. And yet he's carried out this warfare. And to go to the question of what do we do? On the prevention and deterrence side, so far the model has been one of trying to shame the shameless, reaching out to these leaders and saying, didn't you know that it's wrong to use children? They already know that, and you can see very subtle examples of it. For example, in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers there, the headstones for fallen child soldiers, don't have the date of their birth on it, because they know history is going to judge them that way. So it's not a question of trying to shame the shameless, it's actually trying to alter the dynamic, create costs for them, not advantages. And so that has to include prosecuting them for war crimes, because this is the most easy to prove war crime out there. There's no question of, well, I didn't know about this massacre, I didn't allow it, if I had known I would have stopped it. You cannot plead ignorance by the fact that 60% of your force is made up of 12-year-olds. You can't claim you didn't know. But we also have to realize that there are certain situations, in particular with these warlord groups, where we're not going to be able to reach them. They're going to be out there in the jungle. We will not be able to seize them. And so then we have to find what is it that they want, what is it that they need, and go after that. Is it shutting down their weapons supply? Shutting down the illegal trade in light weapons, which has been something that the U.S. has been on the wrong side of that, where we've made it harder to shut down the illegal trade of light weapons? Or is it going after the enablers, the countries and corporations that are trading with these guys and pushing the profits into the practice? And you know, a model maybe to look at is the way we dealt with apartheid, where we knew we couldn't just go after that government, we also went after the corporations. Those are some of the things that we need to think about. But at the end of the day, we've got to start making them march to our tune rather than the other way around.
To what extent are child soldiers and the militias they serve the natural consequence of the neglect on the part of industrialized nations towards the developing world? You want to address this?
I think the question implies the answer. If, particularly for our country, the biggest country on the Hill, if we choose to use this immense power for what are, to my mind, mad utopian dreams of spreading liberty in the name of warfare, or warfare in the name of liberty, whatever the cockeyed idea is, it not only seems wrong in itself, but it's an absolute avoidance of the question that you asked, the use of that power for the powerless, for the people who need the help, children being the weakest. I mean, remember, which these two fellows know particularly well, the thing about childhood is that it's helpless. The thing about childhood is that children do what they're told. That's how we, in the most benign circumstances, teach them the interesting and moral life that we hope they will have. But give the wrong impetus, the wrong way to teach, it's still the same helpless child who has to go where he's told to go, be pushed into things. I'm going to stray a little from the question, I hope, forgive me, but before I do, are there children present here? Good, because I'm going to tell you something that will lock this in. I haven't told this story in a while. I was talking about what adults will do to children in order to create a state of mind that so horrific, so nightmarish that you cannot imagine the child scrambling out of forever. One child who came to the Khawidang camp in Thailand, the largest of the refugee camps to which the Cambodian children escaped when they could escape, was named Po, P-E-O-V. And she didn't say anything for a year after she had come to this camp. Wonderful psychologist named Neil Boothby. I must tell you that if sometimes we are doubtful of the uses of Western psychology, this was a context in which it was heartening to see that the idea of getting someone to talk about even the most painful problem can work. Anyway, Poe drew. The only thing she did do was to draw a circle that looked like a kind of wagon wheel with a little circle in between, and then a little girl standing off to the side, and a rope that seemed to extend from the outer rim of the circle, but it was a confusing cipher to anybody looking at this. And then finally, after a year, through the gentle and useful prodding of Neil Boothby, she told what this all meant. The circle was used on a child who escaped from the Pol Pot work camp, or on children who escaped. It wasn't a circle at all. It wasn't a wheel. It was a portable guillotine that had been invented by, you can imagine this context of invention, by the Khmer Rouge. This was placed over a child's head, and the lines of demarcation that looked like spokes of a wheel were in fact the demarcations of blades, so that it worked like a camera lens, closed and open. And then the strings that you saw leading from this were to close the lens and therefore decapitate the child. But it wasn't the adults who worked this terrible device. The adults made the children do it. And so when Poe was not speaking, she was not speaking of an event so horrific to her that it's amazing that she ever spoke again. And I tell that story not to shock you or to depress you, but to give an idea of the depths to which the purposeful adults in these contexts will sink if they think it serves their purpose.
Chris, I think it's important to reframe the question and reframe these issues of aid, whether we are a stingy or a generous nation or not, and realize that it's not just a test of our generosity, but it's about investing in the future, heading off future occurrences of U.S. soldiers fighting children or future occurrences of terrorism and the like. And I'll give you two examples of this. One is Sierra Leone. There was more than, is between estimates of 15 to 20,000 child soldiers there. In the first UN peacekeeping operation that went there, they sent one child psychologist, one. Sierra Leone was a fundraising hub for Al-Qaeda, where they converted their cash into diamonds prior to 9/11. Another example is Afghanistan. There was more than 8,000 child soldiers in Afghanistan that were used by the Northern Alliance and the Taliban. After we toppled the Taliban, it was 2 years before we spent one penny on rehabilitation and reintegration and demobilization of those children. So we gave the warlords 2 more years to tap into that 8,000 children. And the only reason we spent that money was it was really about providing aid to the 3 kids who we'd held at Guantanamo and then returned back to Afghanistan. And there's, an interesting story of at Guantanamo we have Camp X-Ray, which is for the adults, and little discussed is Camp Iguana, which is the one where the juveniles are held. And we've in effect painted ourselves into a corner where on one hand we treat these kids really well in Camp Iguana. It's a converted house on the beach. They play volleyball, they learn how to play bocce, they've learned mathematics, English, they watch DVDs. Their favorite film is actually Castaway, the Tom Hanks movie, because they kind of connect to it. One, there's not a lot of dialogue, and the other part is they also see themselves as someone who was plucked away and dropped on a desert island. But at the end of the day, the military is frustrated by this because they don't want to be in the business of holding kids there forever, and they can't figure out how to get out of this cycle. And so it's not just a humanitarian question, but it also has a military question to it.
I think we can take some questions. If anyone has any, please come to the microphone, and please keep the questions concise.
I'm curious about the idea of accountability for these leaders. The International Criminal Court just issued warrants against a bunch of the leaders of the LRA in Uganda, and I'm wondering what if you think there's a worry that might prolong the conflict. You say children are going to do what they're told. These leaders most likely are going to tell them they're going to prosecute you if you surrender. So what do you think is going to happen? Is that an effective strategy to try and hold these guys accountable while the wars are still going on?
Thank you. You want to do that, Peter?
I think it is with a caveat. The first is we have to make clear that these indictments are not for the children, they're for the leaders who've put them into that. And you have to have a public affairs strategy around it to make sure that that message is getting out there. The other part is the International Criminal Court is a great start. Unfortunately, the U.S. has sort of done our utmost to undermine it. And that's a longer term question. I think ultimately we will become a part, but it's not going to happen in the near term. And so then we go to the question, well, what are the other things that we can do now? And we've actually started this process of creating ad hoc tribunals, the tribunal for the Balkans, tribunal for Rwanda, but they've always been geographically set. There's no reason, there's nothing under the law that says that they can't be issue-based, that you could not have an ad hoc tribunal for those that targets those who use child soldiers. And one of the interesting things is this would actually be a very easy issue to get to the UN Security Council level. Because the first is, what nation is going to try and defend that practice? No one on the Security Council is, because it's already a crime. The second part is, the Security Council actually has already issued a number of resolutions that specifically identify leaders who are using child soldiers. So it's already there at the international community level who's doing it and the evidence that's there. So it's something we can be novel about it. The other thing is, going after the enablers. It's someone who's aiding child abuse. And so when there are corporations or other states that are profiting after this, we got to go after them as well. And this is one of the burdens of the humanitarian community, is that it's focused all its efforts on outreach and meeting with these leaders repeatedly and nothing on enforcement. And I guess the last example of that shows it, which is pertinent today, is the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. They signed a ceasefire more than a couple years ago. They've since that violated the ceasefire by recruiting, mainly through abduction, more than 1,700 children, including now the recruiting among the refugee camps after the tsunami. And yet, the international community continues to meet with these guys. They promise, oh, we've stopped. We catch them again. They promise, oh, we've stopped this time. We promise this time. You can't keep meeting with them. You've got to start exacting some costs.
Can you please come to the microphone?
how many young people are at the Camp Iguana? And also, are our troops prepared in any fashion for coming up against child soldiers? When they do they do anything differently?
The numbers at Camp Iguana have ranged from 3 to 6. Now, there's an interesting backstory to that, which is Camp Iguana is for under the age of 16. We made up that age is our determination. It doesn't have either backing in U.S. domestic law nor in international law. And so what we've done is taken those that are between that 16 to 18 point and put them in the general populace, which pretty much ensures that they're going to be pulled back into it. When someone's in prison, they get pulled in by the leaders. So it's a small set that are there. And the decision to take that was one that it was ad hoc. And this goes to the military response, is because this issue hasn't gotten the coverage, the responses have been ad hoc. We haven't given the intelligence support to our troops, the training, the equipment, all the kind of backing that they need. And there's two really good examples of that. The first is when I was writing the book a couple years ago, we were about to go into Liberia. We had a U.S. Marine Force right off the shore. And I got an email from one of the officers on board one of the ships, and he said, "We've seen on the TV that there's some child soldiers there, but we've gotten nothing from Washington about it, neither how many there are or what to do about it." And I wrote back and said, actually 60% of the force there, an estimated 20,000, are children. And it would be important if 20,000 had blue skin, let alone children, with all the dilemmas that it presents for soldiers. And so I sent them a draft of the book, but that's not the way the system is supposed to work. And then we saw that also repeat itself now in Iraq, where one of the things that soldiers want to have are non-lethal weapons, not to replace their rifles, but to give them another option on the battlefield, something that can incapacitate a foe, but without causing permanent harm. The armchair generals back in DC, because they're not big ticket budget items, haven't spent on that. And a particular incident during the invasion was one where U.S. Army forces that were moving through Karbala were being fired on by 2 Iraqi boys that were between 10 and 12, and they were shooting RPGs at them. And the unit, which had not even been told that they might be fired on by children, stopped, pulled back, talked amongst themselves what to do, so not the military optimal solution. First called out to the kids, said stop, that didn't work. Then they fired a warning shot, that didn't work. And then they had to shoot to kill. And then that unit had severe problems in its morale and psychological trauma after the fact. To go back to one of the things they wished they had had was a non-lethal weapon that could have incapacitated those kids and allowed them to advance, would have saved lives on our side and the opposite side. In the entire U.S. military, there are 60 non-lethal weapon sets. We sent 6 to Iraq. We're not supporting the troops the way they need it.
I have 2 questions. One is, what is the success rate of rehabilitating the child soldiers? And 2, what is the real story on flying all these lost boys out of Sudan on KLM flights to Minnesota and places like that? Is that a successful way to rehabilitate people who've been living in the skillet of the earth,
Mm-hmm.
So...
You want to?
Well, I can only speak to the rehabilitation question and that in an anecdotal way, but journalism, which I really don't do much of anymore, has very few rewards. But occasionally, a story that you do has a nice ending. And when I did Children of War, it was a story, cover story for Time, and so Time gets around the world and here, and there were several people in this country who, reading about the kids who were written about, became foster parents. But one of them, particularly, there's no way you can see it, but a very cute little boy, a Cambodian boy named T. Kim Seng. I myself am much younger in this picture, and he was reared in Massachusetts by a very careful couple, and he now is in his 30s and he's married, and he's stayed in touch, and he's come to see my wife and me. He's just written a little book about what he's been doing. Now, here's a boy who had to bury his own parents and saw one of them executed in front of his eyes, and walked 60 miles on his own when he was 8 years old from Cambodia to Thailand to escape. And I must tell you, as saddening as the original story was with this boy, it's just as heartening to see the resilience of children too. I don't know whether these, I'm not skilled enough in psychology to know how these buried torments may affect them, but I imagine they're not different in kind. They may be different in scope from the sadnesses of all children everywhere, including ourselves, who manage to put things in proportion. So I don't know. Peter would speak to it much more authoritatively. I don't know how the being a soldier would affect, but I know being a victim as a child seems to have create a situation where you can rebound.
I think it's important to remember that they're both soldiers and victims at the same time. And the heroes of the book are the children who are now out there trying to prevent other children from falling into this. And for example, in Sierra Leone, there's a radio station that targets children, but it's actually operated by children. And so there are, kids can recover, but again, it's the big if. Are they getting the support that they need? Are we investing in the rehabilitation programs, demobilization, et cetera, to break the cycle? And when we don't, we shouldn't be surprised that these wars start up over and over and over again. And so again, we should look at these as opportunities to head off warfare, not just as nice things that we're doing. The question you asked of the Lost Boys, there's actually an interesting backstory to where the Lost Boys came from. And the Lost Boys were, during the Sudanese Civil War, the rebel force, there was numbers of refugee, and they set up a deal with the humanitarian groups that they would have a camp for boys next to the military camp. And the aid groups went along with that. And the reason was that the rebel groups wanted that pool of reserves right nearby that they could tap into. And when the war went badly for them, things fell apart, and that group of boys then moved off into the desert collectively together and spent, I think it was a good 3 years moving back and forth. And ultimately they were, as you said, a good number were airlifted around the globe. Here, many came back to the US, and it's the same stories. Many of them are now leading happy, healthy lives. They're enrolled in high schools, et cetera. But that's a Band-Aid on top of the practice. It's not the way you deal with it in a whole. You know, if I could answer, the question was.
Why don't you repeat the question?
The question was, why did we do this in Sudan? Why did we focus on Sudan and not elsewhere? And you know, if I could answer why the press chooses to cover one war more than the other, you know, I would have a career in media studies. And one of the things Chris has written about, and also in the book, is this question of, you know, focusing on tragedy in the Balkans. At the same time, you know, there was so much tragedy in the Congo, and it's important in terms of coverage because that is then the aid follows. And when you look at the per capita aid that was given towards the Balkans, it was about 100 times higher per person than it was in the Congo. And it doesn't mean that it wasn't needed in the Balkans. It just means that, you know, we focus on different issues. Why did we decide Darfur was the important one, but you know, the other ones ongoing weren't?
I just want to speak to the issue of trauma, which you raised. As somebody who spent almost 2 decades of their life around this kind of organized institutional violence, around a lot of violent death, you can never walk away from that without suffering from various degrees of post-traumatic stress disorder. And you carry that with you for the rest of your life. I think, to somehow think that people can walk away from a situation like the Sudan or the Congo as a child warrior and not cope with very dark demons for the rest of their lives is naive. The tragedy is that the lost boys are a fraction of 1% here. We're talking about people who never escape these kinds of situations, and after they're traumatized, are re-traumatized. The other problem, which you run into places like Gaza or Liberia, is that, in a way, because they have been robbed of their childhood, they have no other way to live, no other way to function. And when they try and step outside of that role as a warrior or as an armed combatant in a conflict, many times they fall back into exactly the same kind of poverty and marginalization that drew them into the armed movement to begin with. And so there's a terrible kind of recidivism where people keep being thrown back into these movements, that there can be a lull in this kind of militia warfare that then rises up again. And I do think that poverty and the breakdown of central authority and the fact that those of us on the outside intervene in such paltry ways makes this a problem that is, as Peter pointed out, is growing. And one that I think, and I think you do get to this point in your book as well, is going to come back and haunt us. Because we all live in one community, we all live in one planet. And what the figures you had are staggering in terms of how many people are living on less than $2 a day?
I think it's about a couple hundred million.
A couple hundred million.
Yeah.
Well, it's more than that even, I think. I mean, there are terrible, terrible situations that I think propel people into this kind of Hobbesian universe, and we have to address the conditions that create the Hobbesian universe.
One thing to add in terms of how it's going to haunt us is the flip side of this, which is one of the interviews I did was a British soldier who'd fought child soldiers in Sierra Leone. When he went back home, he had to be hospitalized for severe depression, had to go to a hospital to deal with it. And as our forces engage with these kids, we'll see this come to pass in a couple years as well. And we're not prepared for it right now because we're in denial that it's even happening, let alone that this is something that soldiers have to deal with.
It is a difficult issue to extricate from the context. I keep coming back to this because one would naturally ask the question, well, if we could remove children from wars, then wars would be great. If we dealt with this particular problem, then the situation itself would be where it should be. And I just find the whole notion of addressing that, what is the larger problem, in terms of the specific, useful, kind, humane, and maybe even practical at some point. But you're still dealing in a larger situation that will always recur, as you were saying, because the enticements are the same and the species is the same.
I will ask the three gentlemen on the panel if they have any further closing comments, and then we will wrap up. And they are available to answer questions and sign books as soon as we're done here. Thank you.
I think the only comment I'd like to add is that in situations like Iraq, in situations like the Congo, in situations like Sierra Leone, murder, which is always part of war, and I distinguish between murder and killing, as killing being the shooting to death of an armed opponent. and murder being the killing of an innocent. That in insurgencies, in warfare where there are no lines of demarcation, murder usually becomes predominant. And that the consequence of that kind of murder of innocents, we have 100,000 dead Iraqis, is one that distorts, inflames, enrages a society and essentially creates a culture of death. You certainly see it in Gaza with the constant, almost deification of the shaheeds, of the martyrs. And you have this yearning on the part of children to essentially not carry out a kind of vengeance and empower themselves, because they live in a universe so distorted where it's not just that they have the diminished power of childhood, but they and everyone around them are powerless. It has a kind of spiral effect. It has a kind of snowball effect that I think we're seeing in Iraq. And somehow in those kinds of conflicts, all of the components work to essentially foster and create the growth of these kinds of militia, this kind of killing, and entice these kinds of children into it. And it becomes a matter of addressing the nature of the conflicts themselves before you can begin to address the problem of children warriors as well.
I have nothing further to say, but I'm happy to give Peter the last word.
Childhood's the point in human life where identities are formed and where the notions of right and wrong are formed. And what's happening with this is really the destruction of childhood itself, where you're taking children and plunging them into an environment where killing is not only sanctioned, it's rewarded, and it's punished if it doesn't happen. And the consequence of this is not just wars are more tragic. It means that wars are easier to start. They have a higher cost to them in terms of casualties, level atrocities, means they're harder to end, and they often start up again. And so it's something that affects us. It's not just an issue that takes place somewhere else. And it's for these reasons that children have no place in warfare, except for the fact that now they do. And so it's up to us to end that.
Thank you very much.
There. And now I have the great pleasure of kicking off this author-to-author event with Dr. P.W. Singer, Roger Rosenblatt, and moderated by Chris Hedges. And so forgive me for this canned introduction, but I want to make sure that I introduce these guys properly and give them the credit that they deserve. Dr. Singer is the National Security Fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies Program at the Brookings Institution and Director of the Brookings Project on U.S. Policy toward the Islamic World. He's written for the Boston Globe, the L.A. Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Current History, Survival, International Security, and World Policy Journal. He's provided commentary on military affairs for media outlets including ABC, Al Jazeera, BBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, and NBC. And this event this evening is to discuss his new book published by Pantheon this month, Children at War. And also participating this evening is Roger Rosenblatt. He's a journalist, an author, playwright, and teacher. His essays for the NewsHour have won a Peabody and an Emmy Award. His essays for Time magazine have won 2 George Polk Awards. His journalism career began in 1975 as a literary editor of the New Republic. He's been a columnist and an editor-at-large for Life magazine, editor of U.S. News and World Report, a columnist and editorial board member of the Washington Post, and editor-at-large of Time, Inc. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, the New Republic, Esquire, and I'm sure many, many, many more places. His book, Children of War, an account of young people growing up on modern battlegrounds from Northern Ireland to the Middle East and Cambodia, won the 1983 Robert F. Kennedy Book Prize and was a National Book Critics Circle finalist. And finally, our moderator this evening, Christopher Hedges, is a reporter for the New York Times, was a war correspondent for nearly 2 decades in Central America, Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. He is the author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which was a National Book Critics Circle Awards finalist. And his new book, Losing Moses on the Freeway, America's Broken Covenant with the Ten Commandments, will be published in June, so please check that out when it comes out. And now I have the great pleasure again of welcoming these three to the table. Thank you.
Why don't you start?
Well, I wanted to begin by thanking all of you for coming out this evening, and I thought it best to start off what's a chilly evening outside with a chilling quote. This is from a young boy in West Africa. I was attending primary school. The rebels came and attacked us. They killed my mother and father in front of my eyes. They took me with them. They trained us to fight. The first time I killed someone, I got so sick I thought I was going to die. But I got better. My fighting name was Blood Never Dry. As our moderator mentioned, and hopefully this will help answer that. And then finally, I wanted to offer a new lens to look at this issue, not just the pure moral tragedy of it, but point out that there are some real-world implications for it, and real-world implications even for us in the West who don't know about this. For example, the fact that our soldiers are out there dealing with it every single day. And with that, we see that there's not just a moral obligation to act, but a strategic mandate to act as well. And today, security is the new coin of the realm, and hopefully that'll force our hands a little bit. So what I'd like to do in sort of the brief remarks today is talk about where this has come from, what's happening out there, what are the causes of it, and then later on we can talk about what can we do. But I think it's important first to start off with the history of this. The rule once held in warfare that children had no place in it, neither as victims nor as participants. Now the rule is that war is not complete without them. To put it another way, when you look at the last 4,000 years of warfare, when children appear in it, it's mainly as footnotes in small isolated instances. For example, in the Navy ships of Admiral Nelson, you had the powder monkeys, which were young boys who ran ammunition back and forth. In our Civil War, there was one battle, the Battle of Newmarket in 1864, where the Confederacy used a unit of 247 VMI cadets. But these were exceptions to what the rule used to be. And we typically...
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Housing Works Bookstore Cafe. I have the great pleasure of introducing this evening, this event this evening. My name is Molly Michael. I am the Director of Marketing here, and I'm happy to welcome C-SPAN and Book TV back to the space to cover this really fabulous event. Before I tell you about our participants this evening, I just want to give you a very brief overview about Housing Works and the bookstore for those of you who don't know much about the space or about Housing Works. We are a nonprofit bookstore. All of our stock is donated. We're run almost entirely by volunteers, and all of our proceeds go toward Housing Works, Inc., which is the largest minority-controlled AIDS service organization in the entire country. And we serve tens of thousands of clients annually. We provide housing and advocacy at the state and city and federal levels. And it's even more important to provide these kinds of services in New York City in particular in this country, because while in New York City we make up 3% of the United States population, we are home to 16% of this country's AIDS cases. So here in New York, we really are ground zero for the epidemic nationwide. So thank you so much for coming out this evening and supporting such a great cause. And also, if you are ever interested in visiting our website, all of our events are posted. You can make a donation to Housing Works, Inc. It's housingworks.org, and I encourage you all to to go.
Research is on changes in warfare, in particular the rise of new forces in warfare and how it affects national security. And Children at War looks at one of the darker sides of this, the rise of child soldier groups. As Nobel Peace Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, quote, "It is immoral that adults should want children to fight their wars for them. There is simply no excuse, no acceptable argument for arming children. The problem is, while there's no moral excuse, this practice is out there and it's growing every single day." And so what the book seeks to do is take the first comprehensive look at it. Why is it happening? How is it happening? What are the implications of it? And with that, what can we do about it? And in the book, I tried to tap into expertise, everything from military history to neuropsychology. The interviews I did for it ranged from child soldiers to mercenaries who'd been hired to fight them. And my hope in writing it was really three things. The first is, once you learn of this issue and the fact that it's out there but so few people are aware of it, you feel compelled to tell these stories and get the message out that these children are not only victims, they're also heroes at the same time. The second thing is that I wanted to tell it in a way that was not only interesting and brought the tragedy to the front, but also added to understanding, with the idea that our responses so far have not been effective. And part of that's because we haven't dealt with the real underlying causes of what's going on.